Douglas MacArthur, one of the most polarizing yet revered figures in U.S. military history, led with unmatched boldness. Born into a military family, he rose to prominence in World War I and became a central figure in World War II and the Korean War. His leadership in the Pacific theater, particularly his famous return to the Philippines, cemented his legacy. However, his conflicts with political leaders, particularly during the Korean War, make him both a hero and a complex figure. His career is a study of courage, controversy, and unparalleled military strategy. Douglas MacArthur was born into a military family in Little Rock, Arkansas, on January 26, 1880. His father, Arthur MacArthur Jr., was a Civil War hero, winning the Medal of Honor. Growing up, Douglas was instilled with a deep sense of duty and patriotism that would guide him throughout his life. His upbringing was shaped by frequent moves due to his father's military career. Douglas had a competitive spirit and excelled academically, but his heart was set on following in his father's military footsteps. In 1899, he entered the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. MacArthur excelled at West Point, graduating first in his class in 1903. He was known for his intellect and physical prowess, qualities that would serve him well in his military career. Early on, his peers and superiors noted his natural leadership abilities. Upon graduation, MacArthur was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Corps of Engineers. His early assignments took him to the Philippines, Japan, and other regions in the Pacific. This exposure to Asia would later prove invaluable in his career. World War I brought MacArthur into the spotlight. He served with distinction as the commander of the 42nd Rainbow Division. His leadership during the Battle of St. Mihiel and the Meuse-Argonne Offensive earned him 7 Silver Stars and widespread respect. He was a fearless leader who often led his men from the front lines, earning their admiration. His bold tactics and relentless pursuit of victory made him a formidable commander. He was promoted to brigadier general during the war, further elevating his status. After the war, MacArthur was appointed superintendent of West Point. He introduced reforms that modernized the academy, focusing on both academic rigor and physical fitness. His changes were initially controversial but ultimately successful. In the 1930s, MacArthur was tasked with overseeing the defense of the Philippines. He was named Field Marshal of the Philippine Army, the only American to hold such a title. This role allowed him to deepen his understanding of the Pacific region. By the time World War II broke out, MacArthur had already established himself as one of the top military leaders in the U.S. Army. He was tasked with defending the Philippines from the looming Japanese threat. However, the attack on Pearl Harbor would change everything. In December 1941, just hours after Pearl Harbor, Japan launched an invasion of the Philippines. Despite fierce resistance, MacArthur's forces were overwhelmed. He and his troops were forced to retreat to the Bataan Peninsula, marking a low point in his career. The situation in the Philippines worsened, and President Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to leave for Australia. Reluctant to abandon his men, MacArthur made his now famous promise, "I shall return." His departure marked a turning point in the Pacific Campaign. MacArthur arrived in Australia in March 1942, where he began planning the counteroffensive against Japan. His island-hopping strategy aimed to bypass heavily fortified Japanese positions and strike at their vulnerable points. This approach would eventually turn the tide in the Pacific. While in Australia, MacArthur also had to manage the complex relationships between the Allies. His leadership style was authoritative, but he knew how to navigate the political intricacies of wartime diplomacy. He became a central figure in the Allied strategy. In 1944, MacArthur fulfilled his promise by leading the liberation of the Philippines. The U.S. victory was a pivotal moment in the Pacific War, and MacArthur's return was met with widespread jubilation. His leadership had proven decisive. Despite the challenges of the Pacific theater, MacArthur's perseverance and tactical brilliance paid off. His strategy not only weakened Japanese forces but also secured key victories for the Allies. He had re-established himself as one of the world's leading military figures. MacArthur's victories in the Pacific were critical in the eventual defeat of Japan. His ability to coordinate large-scale operations and lead complex coalitions set him apart. But as the war neared its end, his relationship with Washington became strained. MacArthur's outspoken personality and his sometimes controversial decisions led to conflicts with military and political leaders. Nevertheless, his role in the Pacific theater cemented his place in history. His leadership had helped shape the course of World War II. So far, we explored MacArthur's early life, his West Point education, and his rise through the military ranks. His leadership during World War I, earning several Silver Stars, marked him as a fearless commander. Transitioning into World War II, his defense of the Philippines and subsequent promise, "I shall return," showcased his determination. The island-hopping strategy proved decisive in the Pacific. As we enter Chapter 2, MacArthur transitions to the post-war occupation of Japan and the complex leadership during the Korean War, where political disagreements ultimately led to his dismissal. After Japan's surrender in 1945, MacArthur was appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers SCAP. His job was to oversee the occupation and rebuilding of Japan, a task that would become one of his greatest legacies. He approached the role with a mix of military discipline and diplomatic finesse. Under MacArthur's leadership, Japan underwent a rapid transformation. He spearheaded political, economic, and social reforms that aimed to rebuild the nation as a peaceful democracy. One of his most notable achievements was the creation of a new Japanese constitution in 1947. The constitution, which remains in effect to this day, renounced war and prohibited Japan from maintaining a standing army. MacArthur's vision of a peaceful and democratic Japan was realized, and his efforts were widely praised both in Japan and internationally. However, MacArthur's time in Japan was not without its challenges. His authoritarian style sometimes clashed with Japanese officials, and his relationship with the US government grew increasingly strained. Despite this, he remained a towering figure in the post-war world. In 1950, the Korean War broke out when North Korea invaded South Korea. Once again, MacArthur was called upon to lead UN forces in a major conflict. His decisive leadership helped prevent the collapse of South Korea in the early months of the war. One of MacArthur's most famous military maneuvers came during the Korean War, the amphibious landing at Incheon. The operation was a stunning success, allowing UN forces to retake Seoul and push the North Koreans back across the 38th parallel. MacArthur was hailed as a hero once again. However, the Korean War also marked the beginning of MacArthur's downfall. As the war dragged on, MacArthur pushed for more aggressive tactics, including bombing Chinese positions and potentially expanding the war into China. His strategy conflicted with President Truman's desire to avoid a larger conflict. The tension between MacArthur and Truman came to a head in April 1951. After MacArthur publicly criticized Truman's policies, the president made the controversial decision to relieve him of his command. The move shocked the American public and sparked a nationwide debate. Despite his dismissal, MacArthur returned to the United States as a hero. His Old Soldiers Never Die speech before Congress was met with thunderous applause. Many Americans still saw him as a national treasure, despite his falling out with Truman. In the aftermath of his dismissal, MacArthur considered a political career. There were even discussions of him running for president. However, his political ambitions never fully materialized, and he eventually retired from public life. MacArthur spent his later years writing his memoirs and reflecting on his storied career. Though he never returned to a position of power, his legacy as one of America's greatest military leaders was secure. He remained a respected figure until his death in 1964. One of the key aspects of MacArthur's legacy was his ability to balance military force with diplomacy. His efforts in Japan showcased his capacity for nation-building, while his command in Korea demonstrated his tactical brilliance. Yet, his downfall also highlighted the risks of unchecked military power. MacArthur's relationship with the US government was complex. His larger-than-life personality and reluctance to follow orders ultimately led to his dismissal. But despite these controversies, his contributions to the U.S. military and global affairs were undeniable. MacArthur's impact on Japan cannot be overstated. His reforms laid the foundation for a peaceful and prosperous Japan that emerged as one of the world's leading economies. His role in shaping the modern Pacific landscape is still felt today. In the Korean War, MacArthur's initial successes helped stabilize the region and prevent the spread of communism. But his desire for total victory clashed with the more measured approach favored by the Truman administration. This conflict ultimately led to his dismissal. As we look back on MacArthur's life, it is clear that he was a man of immense talent and ambition. His leadership was defined by both brilliance and controversy, and his legacy continues to be debated by historians. Yet, there is no denying his place as one of the most influential figures of the 20th century. MacArthur's famous quote, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away," reflects his deep sense of duty and service. He dedicated his life to his country, and his contributions shaped the course of American military history. Today, he is remembered as both a hero and a complex, sometimes flawed, leader.
All right, buckle up, because today we're diving into the whirlwind life of General Douglas MacArthur. You know, everyone remembers that iconic "I shall return" line, but let's be honest, how many of us actually know the context? What were the stakes? What even led him to that very moment?
It's funny how history boils down to just these sound bites. Yeah, its greatest hits. With MacArthur, though, there's a whole symphony of ambition, military genius, and, yeah, let's be real, a healthy dose of controversy, too.
Exactly. And that's what I love about these deep dives. You send over some amazing material articles, biography excerpts, even some deep cuts on his military strategies.
Yeah.
So let's just jump into it. Where do we even begin with a figure as complex and, dare I say, larger than life as MacArthur?
Well, it's important to remember that while MacArthur's life was marked by battles and campaigns, his story isn't just about military conquests. It's also about the burdens of leadership, navigating a world in constant flux, and the fine line between ambition and overreach.
And talk about ambition. This is a guy who graduated top of his class at West Point. Do you think that kind of early success sets the tone for a whole career?
It certainly lays the groundwork.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just intellect that set MacArthur apart. He had this undeniable magnetism, that rare ability to not only strategize, but to inspire as well. Those who served under him often spoke of his charisma as much as his tactical brilliance.
Wow. Okay, so we've got this West Point prodigy, clearly destined for great things, but even military geniuses face setbacks, right?
Absolutely. Take the Philippines campaign during World War II. This wasn't some glorious victory, but a brutal struggle against overwhelming odds. In fact, your source from a soldier's first-hand account paints a harrowing picture of those early days of the war. He describes this feeling of abandonment, the desperation, and ultimately the horrors of the Bataan Death March.
It's hard to imagine the weight of that experience, not just for the soldiers, but for MacArthur himself, having to make that agonizing decision to retreat, knowing what awaited those left behind.
Exactly, and this is where his strategic mind really comes into play. That experience in the Philippines, as devastating as it was, became a turning point. It fueled his determination to innovate, to find a new approach to fighting in the Pacific.
Which leads us to island hopping. It sounds so simple in theory, but I imagine the reality was anything but.
Right. It wasn't just about hopping from one island to the next. MacArthur recognized the Japanese military's strength, but he also identified their vulnerability. Supply lines stretched thin across vast distances. So instead of engaging in these costly frontal assaults, he targeted key islands, strategically cutting off supply routes and using air power to weaken enemy positions for making a move. It was a high-risk, high-reward strategy.
And a strategy that many of his contemporaries initially saw as reckless. Right?
Absolutely. Some even called it delusional. But MacArthur, convinced of his analysis and driven by the memory of those lost in the Philippines, pushed forward, ultimately turning the tide of the war in the Pacific.
It's incredible how he took that gamble, that leap of faith in his own judgment, and ultimately reshaped the course of the war. And speaking of leaps of faith, let's talk about that "I shall return" promise. It's one thing to say it, but to actually pull it off against all odds, that's next level.
It's a moment etched in history for sure. The Philippines liberated, MacArthur back at the beaches of Leyte. It's the stuff of legend. But And this is where those leadership burdens you mentioned come into play. Even as he was being celebrated as a liberator, tensions were simmering beneath the surface.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that his leadership style wasn't exactly, well, diplomatic.
Let's just say MacArthur was not known for mincing words. One of your sources, a biography of President Osmeña, who led the Philippine Commonwealth during the war, describes a clash they had over the handling of collaborators. MacArthur, according to this account, could be incredibly stubborn, even dismissive of civilian authority when it came to military matters.
So even amidst the euphoria of victory, that tension between his brilliance and that, let's call it his forceful personality, was starting to show.
Exactly. And this leads us to a truly fascinating chapter, one that might surprise even those who think they know MacArthur well, the rebuilding of Japan.
Talk about a plot twist. From conquering general to, what, architect of a pacifist nation? It's almost too ironic.
It might seem counterintuitive, but in a way, it's pure MacArthur. He was a pragmatist at heart. Remember, he'd spent years in the Pacific. He understood the region's complexities. He knew a remilitarized Japan could easily destabilize the entire area.
So the pacifist constitution, something that seems so at odds with his image as this military leader, was actually a calculated move.
Precisely. In his own words, from a speech he gave to the Japanese Diet, he wanted to ensure that Japan would never again become a menace to the world. He saw the pacifist constitution as essential for achieving that goal. And, some historians argue that it was this very act, this fostering of peace, that cemented his legacy as more than just a soldier.
Wow, it's remarkable. He went from fighting the Japanese to, in essence, guiding them toward this new future. But surely not everyone was thrilled with his approach.
Oh, absolutely not. His critics, both in Japan and back home, argued that he held too much power, that he was acting more like an emperor than a liberator. Some even drew parallels to his handling of the Philippines, accusing him of a similar disregard for local voices.
So that friction, that push and pull between his undeniable talent and his tendency to, well, let's just say it, to overreach, it seems to follow him even in peacetime.
It's a recurring theme, wouldn't you say? And this tension comes to a head quite dramatically with the Korean War.
Okay, so we've got MacArthur, this towering figure with a history of bold moves and even bolder opinions stepping onto the Korean peninsula. What could possibly go wrong, right?
Well, you're right to point out his history. MacArthur's track record preceded him. The success of island hopping during World War II solidified his image as a military genius, and the Incheon landing only seemed to confirm his almost, mystical status?
Yeah.
But Korea, as we know, became a turning point, a clash not just of armies, but of ideologies and egos as well.
You mentioned earlier a fundamental disagreement about the war's goals, and it's wild to think that back then people were seriously debating expanding the war, even using nuclear weapons.
Oh, the world was holding its breath back then. You can actually hear the tension in Truman's archived conversations from that time, the weight of those decisions, knowing that escalation could mean a global conflict.
And MacArthur, ever the hawk, wanted to go all in. Was that what? Hubris. A different strategic calculation. What was going on there?
That's the million-dollar question historians are still debating today. Some argue that MacArthur, shaped by his experiences in World War II, saw communism as this existential threat that needed to be extinguished, no matter the cost. Others believe he underestimated China's resolve and allowed his ego to cloud his judgment. It's fascinating to consider how differently things might have unfolded had he taken a less aggressive stance.
So Truman, facing down this potential powder keg, decides to cut MacArthur loose. I can't imagine that went over very well.
It was a political earthquake. Headlines around the world screamed of the conflict. Imagine turning on the radio and hearing that famed General MacArthur had been relieved of duty by the president himself. People were shocked.
And what about MacArthur? How did he handle this very public, very humbling dismissal?
He returned to the U.S., not defeated, but defiant. Remember that old soldiers never die speech we mentioned earlier?
Yeah.
It wasn't just a farewell, it was a manifesto. He directly challenged Truman's approach, warning of the dangers of appeasement, and reaffirming his belief in total victory. You can still feel the raw emotion, the recordings of that speech, the thunderous applause that followed.
A hero's welcome, even in defeat. It's amazing how, even today, he remains such a polarizing figure. Some see him as a visionary, others as reckless. Where do you land on that spectrum?
It's not about picking sides, is it? It's about understanding the man in all his complexity. He was a product of his time, for sure, but he also helped shape that time with his boldness, his flaws, and yes, even his mistakes. MacArthur's story reminds us that history isn't just about dates and battles, but about the choices people make when the stakes are high and the answers are anything but clear.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you with this final thought. Was MacArthur a hero or a liability? A brilliant strategist or a general who overplayed his hand? Dig deeper into the sources we've explored today and decide for yourself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the life and legacy of Douglas MacArthur.
Douglas MacArthur's legacy is one filled with military brilliance and controversy. He was a pivotal leader in some of the 20th century's most significant conflicts, including World War II and the Korean War. His triumphs, like the liberation of the Philippines and his successful occupation of Japan, are tempered by his dismissal due to a clash with President Truman. In the end, MacArthur's towering influence on global military strategy remains unquestionable, with his bold leadership and iconic "Old Soldiers Never Die" speech leaving a lasting mark on American history.